Hey everybody, this is the first video um, for Grandizo Munis's Party, State, Stalinism, Revolution. The sections of the piece are titled 1. The Russian Economic System and the Transition to Communism. 2. From Bolshevism to Stalinism. 3. The Party, State, and Stalinist Counter-Revolution. 4. Russian Foreign Policy and World Stalinism. 5. The crisis of the Russian counter-revolution as a result of the crisis of the capitalist system. And it says, to my wife, Arlette, to my children, for all the children, all the women, all the men in the world. Grandizo Munis. Section 1. The Russian economic system and the transition to communism. The rapid recovery and growth of Western capitalism after the war, the widespread paralysis of the proletariat and its ideological indolence, the rise after American power of Russian power and the spread of its Stalinism in Europe and Asia, the balance of nuclear terror, the absence of a struggle for world revolution, the late and reactionary presence of so many nationalisms, the theoretical disarray, when it is not the decline of the partisans of the proletarian revolution, so many phenomena are closely linked together. They are in truth codetermined, but their reciprocal determinism appears to most people masked, entirely distorted by a mystification sown to the winds for half a century, that of the socialist nature of the Russian property system. The fact that at the origin of this mystification is a revolution, or rather, to speak more accurately, a formidable attempt at a world communist revolution, makes the lie even more deceitful and odious. Demystification must be the first step in a theoretical approach that prefigures the reversal of the current situation, especially since it must attack not only Stalinism and Stalinism's clients, but also most of their enemies, who cling to false dead or mechanistic notions, and the result must be a clearly drawn picture of the reactionary course of events, outlining a revolutionary strategy on an international scale. No regime has ever enjoyed outside its borders such widespread prestige as the Russian regime. Despite their criticism, its opponents themselves often contributed to it, while its unconditional supporters and sympathizers transformed its spoliations, its murders, its crimes against the Russian and international proletariat, its abject slander against its adversaries into so many measures of salvation. And it is not yet over. The regime has subjected the proletariat to intense exploitation, coupled with food shortages and the strictest police surveillance, going so far as to monitor thought. It has condemned tens of millions of men to forced labor, executed hundreds of thousands more without legal procedure, tortured people physically and morally to obtain confessions, organized the most falsified trials in history, methodically exterminated the Bolsheviks of 1917, invaded Poland and the Baltic states in agreement with fascist Germany, a conquest endorsed by the United States, with 5 countries and half of Germany to boot. Finally, and I limit myself to the most obvious, after having lent a hand to Hitler, this regime pushed its parties to national defense in the American bloc, regimented the proletariat there, forced it to lay down its weapons, the war barely over, harnessed it to productivity, and thus reinvigorated the tottering system much more than the Marshall Plan. On their return from Moscow, Thérèse and Togliatti were the true saviors of Western capitalism, not at all the Yankee English general staff, nor de Gaulle. Nothing matters. Quote, the USSR, the country of socialism, end quote. Now let me duplicate this piece. It looks like there's a footnote here. Footnote, for my part, I have long referred to this country only as Russia. The acronym USSR contains a lie in each initial. End footnote. Nothing matters. Quote, the USSR, the country of socialism, end quote, is always praised by monstrous and incessant propaganda, as obscurantist as the very facts it falsifies, hides, distorts, or glorifies. This was to be expected, because the pseudo-communist parties are shaped body and soul, for the past, present, and future by the social system reigning in Russia, the nature of which will be defined here. But this propaganda is above all intended to rally a future, quote, intelligentsia, like that which has its headquarters in the Kremlin, the workers and honest individuals being able to be only half duped, not for long and not at all. Once the party and the intelligentsia have climbed to power, it fulfills the same brainwashing function among the workers as bourgeois propaganda. Stalinism knows from Marx himself that ignorance of revolutionary ideas in the proletariat is a necessity for the extraction of surplus value. It is vital for it to plan for this ignorance. But after all, Stalinism plays its part. It is the critical tendencies towards it, even anti-Stalinist ones, who bear the responsibility for the fact that a strong workers' movement did not rise up against it. Among them, the heaviest falls on the Trotskyists, whose arguments, recommending themselves to Trotsky and Lenin, impressed the young more and attached them to conservative positions. The more complete and boldest denunciation of the bestiality of the Stalinist regime, this is no longer even the case for any Trotskyist tendency today, can lead nowhere except to political emasculation from the moment it is dissociated from the social regime and from a critical appreciation of the Russian Revolution. Indeed, for Trotskyism, the Stalinist bureaucracy is one thing, and the ownership of the instruments of production is quite another. It is therefore his notion of the, quote, USSR, degenerated worker state, end quote, where this astonishing differentiation is inscribed, that must be considered immediately. We know the Trotskyist arguments. The political regime is bad, even reactionary. The economic system is good, despite the distortions that the former imposes on it. The former must be fought while defending the latter, nationalization and planning being, in their eyes, the most progressive mode of production in history. In short, quote, we must not throw the baby out with the bathwater, end quote, and consequently, quote, unconditional defense of the USSR, end quote, against all its external enemies. At the beginning of the 5-year plans, these arguments could and did have a certain impact. The fact remains that we were too quick to identify the designation and the designated thing, and neglected the essential factors, as we shall see. But today, after 45 years of this planning, after all we know about the Russian economy, what is stubbornly hidden from us as well as what we are told, both false and true, what relationship can we find with the revolutionary notion of planning and with socialism? Those who still believe they see one are, alas, at the mercy of the Kremlin. Certainly, it has not reestablished private property. It still talks about planning, socialism, and even defense of the revolution. The diehards, for their part, repeat, like a somewhat garbled echo, quote, what we are defending is the remnant of the revolution, not the bureaucracy, end quote. They do not understand that their so-called remnant of the revolution is the breeding ground for Stalinist despotism. Napoleon III, too, used to say, quote, my name is inseparable from the revolution, end quote. However, the economy of his time was undoubtedly the product of the bourgeois revolution, while there was no socialist property or planning resulting from the October Revolution. But let us hypothetically admit, for the sake of theoretical interpretation, and because we must fight the enemy on his own ground, that nationalization and planning as they have been practiced since the first day in Russia come from a socialist revolution. What then should be the starting point for analyzing the Russian phenomenon, the objective character of planning, or the objective subjective character of political power, whose counter-revolutionary tendency was recognized by Trotsky? The defenders of Russia start from planning, which should, according to them, have gotten rid of political power as its own results came about, or else suddenly through a political revolution. However, the Stalinist bureaucracy does not allow itself to be easily categorized under the label of excrescence that they bestow upon it, the Trotskyists bestow upon it. I'm pretty sure that's what he's saying here, who that they is. Its political power would have had no chance of maintaining itself if it did not become a superstructural objectification of the economic system. So even from the point of view of Trotsky's analyses, the dialectical law of transformation, of quantity into quality should be largely confirmed after 50 years of the most absolutist of bureaucratic dominations. There was, in reality, no necessity, no possibility of such a transformation, because on the terrain of a socialist revolution, it is impossible for political power and the economy to move in opposite directions, but we must not anticipate. Wavering between left and right, the various regimes of history based on private property have had political manifestations that express their progressive characteristics. Capitalism was able to concede under the pressure of workers' struggles, if not voluntarily, universal suffrage, the right to organize and strike, freedom of the press, and what are called individual guarantees. It has never been a regime of oppression for the bourgeoisie, but if we admit the existence of true plenty in Russia, we discover in Russia, on the basis of the most progressive system, the most reactionary of the political regimes in history, comparable to Hitler's fascism in the modern era, and in antiquity the most despotic phase of the Roman Empire. Even apart from all other considerations, we would be obliged to recognize that the Russian economy bears no relation to socialism, otherwise we would be throwing overboard the materialist conception of society and history. Economic development and political development would take opposite directions. History would then be Schopenhauer's incomprehensible chaos. The argument of provisional excrescence, the deus ex machina that Trotskyism brings in here, collapses by its own inconsistency. First, the provisional character of the political regime in no way grants it the possibility of carrying out a revolutionary economy, while it itself becomes more and more reactionary. Second, if the bureaucracy's economic management were at all positive, this would have been reflected in its domestic and foreign policy, especially during and after the war. The opposite is obvious. Third, recourse to this argument does not demonstrate or help us understand anything about the nature of the Russian system, but in exchange enlightens us on the thinking of those who advance it. Indeed, they will only admit the existence of capitalism the day they discover a class of individual owners. That is to say, never, because the old capitalism itself tends to eliminate the bourgeoisie. He has already sold a good part of it. Furthermore, the supposed antinomy between planning and bureaucracy, that is, between economic system and political regime, is based on a more general idea, that of the transition period between capitalism and communism. Defenders of Russia believe they are thus providing a scientific explanation of the deviations of the socialist economy from what the socialist economy should be, and even of the crimes of power. This is not the case. On the contrary, this is where the vulnerability and misunderstanding of Trotsky's analyses appear, which have become a right-wing adulteration of the revolutionary concept among current Trotskyists and among certain erudite Marxologists like Pierre Neville. The transition period, Marx called it the lower phase of communism, whether we imagine it to be short or long, must testify to its own nature. It goes without saying, by a continuous progression towards the disappearance of classes, the key to an individual and collective freedom, inaccessible under the wage system, even liberal. However, social differentiations have multiplied with the 5-year plans, and police terror knows no respite. The most crude democracy is intolerable to the Kremlin despots. The hope of a conflict between the nature of the economic system and bureaucracy, supposedly contradictory, has proven radically false. From the outset, it was a serious mistake to assume the existence of a hiatus between the economic system and the bureaucracy, between the structure and the superstructure, their unity, their concordance of interest alone permitting, on the contrary, their respective affirmations. In other words, the industrialization of Russia, however advanced one may imagine it, cannot and will never be able to overcome the bureaucratic regime by itself, simply as a mechanical result of its function. To explore this idea, we must examine the notion of Bonapartism, applied by Trotsky to the Russian political regime, and still misused by those who claim to be Trotsky's followers. The notion of Bonapartism established an untenable parallel between the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution. The Bonapartism of the French Revolution must therefore be analyzed immediately. As a social subversion, as a practical action of man on his history, the French Revolution was not the work of the bourgeoisie, but mainly that of the poor masses of the cities and the feudal serfs. The complete and rapid destruction of the feudal economic survivals and the political apparatus of the absolute monarchy would not have taken place. This is the case in many countries, capitalist for a very long time, without the conquest by the artisans and workers of the right of insurrection, something that the modern proletariat will have to take into account in future post-revolutionary situations. Thanks to this right, the poor districts of Paris wrested one measure after another from the moderate majority of the Convention, often from the Jacobins themselves, going so far as to make an incursion into political power by proclaiming the revolutionary government and establishing the domination of the Commune, destined to have far-reaching and fruitful repercussions. This is how the French democratic bourgeois revolution succeeded in reaching its own completion, a unique case and sometimes gives us a scent of the future world socialist revolution. But the political domination of the poor masses was to be ephemeral, because they did not yet occupy the place or the functions essential to imprint on society a communist orientation, capitalism itself being little developed. However, economic measures directed against certain bourgeois were adopted. It is a fact underlined by Mathiez that the coup d'etat Thermidor broke out when the Committee of Public Safety wanted to implement a law of expropriation for the benefit of the indigents, which affected a good number of speculators and nouveaux riches. The Commune and the poor masses in general, already bridled by Robespierre, were reduced to impotence, but they had forever annihilated the absolute monarchy and feudalism. The process of social and political reorganization that took place between Thermidor and the Bonapartist era itself can only be considered as the stabilization of the bourgeois revolution. Bonapartism did not deny it, but did not destroy its work. It gave it the legal legitimacy and political calm essential to the development of the capitalist economy, freed from its constraints. Beneath his military laurels and his splendor of an upstart emperor, Napoleon hid the sordidness of a system whose progression required that the urban masses be removed from power and confined within the order defined by wage slavery and the dictatorship of the capitalists. In short, given that the capacity of the means of production on both the French and global scales prevented any socialist perspective, the workers and artisans, the sans-culottes in general, had to be removed from the affairs of the bourgeoisie after having destroyed the Ancien Regime. They would only benefit from the fragments of the development of capitalist society. Thermidor undertook this work and Bonapartism completed it. It is as if the bourgeois revolution needed a Thermidor and a Bonapartism, its essential content leading it to develop a class that owns the instruments of production and political power, and a class of wage earners deprived of both. This is just a side note. This is just a personal opinion. It doesn't seem like in Trotsky's sense, or even in like a lot of the ways that I've seen the term Bonapartism used to describe the Soviet Union or to describe post-revolutionary France, is describing this kind of like the political power of the bourgeoisie against the working classes of France. To my understanding, Bonapartism describes the autonomy of the state even from the bourgeoisie. So there's like a degree to within capitalism there's the separation of the political and the economic, and to my understanding in a Bonapartist situation, it describes a state that has grown like autonomous in some sense from civil society in a rather extreme way, while preserving the overall social content of civil society, right? So to my understanding, and this could be a wrong understanding, but if the main instance of Bonapartism, at least in the original Marxian sense, is to describe the Second Empire in France, which in some sense because none of the contending classes, this is how the story goes at least, none of the contending classes were able to achieve outright achieve victory, political victory. So the state kind of held society together in distinction from all of the contending classes, right? But at the same time as restricting the bourgeoisie from political dominance in like a republican form, say for instance, the sorry, without excluding the state from excluding the bourgeoisie from like political control of the state. They at the same time they created a lot of the conditions for the bourgeoisie to grow powerful within civil society, as well as protecting and preserving and enhancing private property rights of the French bourgeoisie. So to my understanding, and you could think of this as like fascism, right, as a form of Bonapartism, right, the kind of like strong state which kind of protects private property rights but has like a bit of a political tension with certain segments of the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie are like subordinated even if they benefit to the state politically, even if they benefit from the state socially. So to my understanding, Bonapartism when applied to a capitalist society is not about like preventing socialism or something like that. Like it's not like what's being described here kind of sounds as if what Bonapartism meant was like keeping the French Revolution from becoming a socialist revolution or preventing popular democracy, which it did prevent popular democracy, but like popular like bourgeois democracy. So it seems like Muniz is describing something, is using this word different than how it's used in Trotsky, or just just in general. He seems like he's kind of giving his own unique spin on Bonapartism. Anyway, maybe he'll say something different, but that's the reading I'm getting here. The process of social and political reorganization that took place between Thermidor and the Bonapartist era itself can only be considered as the stabilization of the bourgeois revolution. Bonapartism did not deny the bourgeois revolution, did not destroy the bourgeois revolution's work. Bonapartism gave the bourgeois revolution the legal legitimacy and political calm essential to the development of the capitalist economy freed from its constraints. Now, this is more in line with what I think is typically meant by Bonapartism. Beneath Napoleon's military laurels and his splendor of an upstart emperor, Napoleon hid the sordidness of a system whose progression required that the urban masses be removed from power and confined within the order defined by wage slavery and the dictatorship of the capitalists. In short, given that the capacity of the means of production on both the French and global scales prevented any socialist perspective, the workers and artisans, the sans-culottes in general, had to be removed from the affairs of the bourgeoisie after having destroyed the Ancien Regime. They would only benefit from the fragments of the development of capitalist society. Thermidor undertook this work and Bonapartism completed it. It is as if the bourgeois revolution needed a Thermidor and a Bonapartism, its essential content leading it to develop a class that owns the instruments of production and political power, and a class of wage earners defined as both. See that? Then he I just reread the paragraph. I didn't mean to reread it. That was so. I don't want to present it as if I meant to reread it. But like he starts with like the conventional meaning of Bonapartism, and then moves into this kind of like this new form. The effect of a Thermidor, not to mention Bonapartism, on a proletarian revolution, even of the ambiguous type that was that of the Russian Revolution, is quite different. Not only the effect, but also the origin. It must be stated here without anticipating what one will read later about the seizure of power by the Soviets in October 1917. It is obviously impossible and at the same time stupid to consider Russian power as a Bonapartism of the communist revolution, as its legal affirmation, or as provisionally indispensable to the subsequent destiny of socialism. The system of production and distribution that the French Revolution was to bring to a head was consubstantial with the bourgeoisie, and the need to bring the classes below it into line called for Bonapartism, which thus appears as a direct emanation of capital. And again, this is a weird thing. It's not just bringing the classes below the bourgeoisie into line, but also the bourgeoisie itself, if need be. Which thus appears as a direct emanation of capital. Not only did the bourgeoisie encounter classes to its left, but it produced classes to its left. Now the proletariat does not find and cannot produce any class below the proletariat itself, and to the proletariat's left, the system of production and distribution that it must establish, requiring the abolition of all classes, including its own. From within the proletariat, it goes without saying, strata situated above it that oppress and exploit it can break away. But to do this, they must oppose the proletariat and socialism even more fiercely than the bourgeoisie, because there is no other way to achieve this. In short, for a workers' revolution, a thermidor represents a total defeat. It cannot proceed from its economic system. There is incompatibility between the two, contrary to what happened during the French Revolution. The Thermidorians of 1794 continued to use revolutionary language while cutting short revolutionary action, properly speaking, and setting a course for the consolidation of capitalism. In this sense, the notion of thermidor is very useful for explaining the reactionary process observed in Russia. If the thermidor of the bourgeois revolution was not able to confess its intentions, which misled many people, including one of the very first future communists, Rakus Babeuf, even more so that of the Russian Revolution, because it arose in opposition to history. Within these limits, and only within these, the notion of thermidor is useful and very eloquent. It indicates a movement to the right within the revolution, peddled by revolutionaries who do not admit it or who do not see it, and leading in France to the free development of the aristocracy of money, in Russia to the counter-revolution, to the economic and political absolutism of the high bureaucracy. On the other hand, the notion of Bonapartism is not applicable to any aspect of this counter-revolution. The only common feature between the Bonaparte regime and that of Russia consists in the defense of their respective positions against the restoration of the old power and against the masses, except that, striking to its right and its left, Bonapartism strictly adhered to the interest of the new ruling class, the bourgeoisie, while Stalinism directly attacks the proletariat, the very key to communist society. And if Stalinism also opposes the bourgeoisie, it is to incorporate the bourgeoisie or to reduce the bourgeoisie to Stalinism's mercy. For it is far from denying its system as Bonaparte denied the old regime. Bonapartism, it has often been repeated, arbitrates between two classes struggling for power. Napoleon Bonaparte arbitrated between the old nobility and the bourgeoisie. He prided himself on being a national reconciler, but Stalinist despotism could not even find the elements necessary for such an arbitration. The remains of the bourgeoisie Stalin quickly assimilated. The proletariat, for its part, was subjected to a condition close to slavery. Herein lies the most important problem of our time. The Stalinist bureaucracy unquestionably advocates the nationalization of the means of labor or state ownership as well as its planning, but this ownership has nothing socialist about it, nor consequently can the plans that govern it, nor can it be considered a first step toward communism, because a workers' revolution must immediately establish itself on socialist economic ground unless it is to be defeated. In this regard, we must recall a fundamental error of Trotsky's, which neither Lenin nor the best Bolsheviks escaped. For Trotsky, state ownership had been established by the revolution, while recognizing that it was not yet socialist ownership. Could there then be a third type of ownership, which would be neither capitalist nor socialist? Then it would become imperative to recognize the existence of a new class of owners who would have to rule over society for an indefinite period. The outcome of the historical drama that capitalism leads to would not be the proletariats, but the class identified with this new type of property. We are thus pushed, whether we like it or not, towards the theory of bureaucratic collectivism, pure vacuity. I will return to this, but it should be added that this supposed class would appear, so to speak, from one day to the next, and would be reactionary from its beginnings. Trotsky lost sight of his own theory of permanent revolution, the first phase of which took place in October 1917 and immediately after, but the second socialist phase never took place. State ownership was not at all the work of the revolution, but on the contrary, of the revolution's failure to reach its socialist phase, which should be characterized not by ownership by any organization, state, union, or party, but by a directly communist possession of the instruments of labor, allowing individual appropriation of the product of social labor. The unequal distribution of products presupposes, in all cases, said Marx, a prior unequal distribution of the instruments of labor. It is impossible to escape it by subterfuges in the transition period. In a word, any revolution that would concentrate ownership in the state or in the unions, which would amount to the same thing, is doomed by the same token. One could not find a better line of demarcation for revolutionaries at the present time. The Stalinist bureaucracy is one, experience shows, with state property, which the Stalinist bureaucracy subjects to a plan. To imagine it as tossed between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, or between socialism and capitalism, is a huge blunder. In Europe, the bourgeoisie took centuries to emerge as a structured class. In Russia, the bourgeoisie cannot even re-emerge, since the overwhelming majority of wealth was created without the bourgeoisie. There remain, especially in the countryside, small landowners, even kulaks. But it is not through agriculture that a bourgeois restoration could take place. The majority of peasants have been reduced to the category of wage laborers in the state establishments known as kolkhozes or sovkhozes. Their situation, however, is not quite the same as that of urban workers. It is somewhat similar to the situation of feudal serfs, whose working time was clearly divided, one part unpaid for the lord, another part for themselves. Thus the kolkhozians give to the state a significant part of their working time, which is only partly paid to them, and they devote the remaining time to their small plot, the product of which belongs to them. However, the bureaucracy represents the extreme right in the picture of Russian classes and social strata. That's a difference. That's a major difference between what Munis is saying and what Trotsky said. For Trotsky, the bureaucracy was like a reactionary center between the bourgeois, the right, represented by the threat of capitalist, which represented the threats to capitalist restoration, and the proletariat. So this is a distinction from Trotsky. However, the bureaucracy represents the extreme right in the picture of Russian classes and social strata. It behaves as such, and there can be no other enemy than it for industrial workers as for those on the land. This reality being incontestable, some shift the problem to the international arena. It would be between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat of the world, and the Stalinist bureaucracy would tip over, and there it would still defend, quote, what remains of the revolution in face of imperialist attempts to impose bourgeois property manu militari. I guess that's view through military conquest. This lubrication at least provides its inventors with an alibi, allowing them to overlook the most glaring facts. A few examples among 1,000. The Kremlin is the main culprit of the defeat for the defeat of the proletariat after the Russian Revolution and for Franco's victory. Yet the Kremlin knew that this defeat would lead to imperialist war. More concretely, the Kremlin allowed Hitler to come to power by giving his German vassals orders not to fight him, even though Hitler could not fail to invade Russia at some point. In the midst of the war, Hitler offered peace to the Western imperialism several times in order to ensure Russia's defeat. They rejected this offer. It was therefore they who saved the supposed remains of the revolution. But if these remnants had existed, they would obviously have accepted Hitler's proposals. The incompatibility of the capitalist and socialist systems of property, dominating by far all imperialist rivalries, that is, within the same system. There is therefore nothing, either inside or outside Russia, that binds the Stalinist bureaucracy to the proletariat. War has been and always will be for it a way of defending its prey. The exploitation of the Russian proletariat and of seizing other prey as far as its military strength allows. Now it is time to examine the economic system around which stand guard the gigantic Russian army, another army of policemen and informers, the Stalinist parties of all countries, all sorts of archaic despots of backward countries, not to mention the left-wing intellectuals and the proponents of the, quote, degenerated workers' state. To better situate the issue and distinguish the forest from the trees, it is essential to recall the revolutionary notion of planning, always left aside when discussing Russian plans. It is a very close connection with the period of transition from capitalism to communism, behind which the defensists hide. If the workers' movement has spoken since Marx of subjecting the post-revolutionary economy to a production plan, it is precisely to ensure the most rapid passage through this period, a fully communist society having to function spontaneous as a whole, tending towards harmony. It is not at all a question of removing or diminishing this or that internal contradiction of capitalism, crises of overproduction, competition between capitalists, between trust or between nations, structural contradictions between use values and exchange values. Post-revolutionary planning must go straight to the suppression of the capitalist system and its consequences. Post-revolutionary planning must put an end to the contradiction between the current form of production and the immediate as well as historical interests of the workers. In short, planning is an instrument for making the economy turn around, the sole guarantee of the future communist civilization. There is no excuse for this. The property system during the transition period must be the same as in the full communist era. Otherwise, where would the social revolution be? Let us admit, for the sake of argument with all the Sovietophiles, in fact Russophiles, that a gap may occur between the theoretical conception and reality, the interstices of which would be filled in different ways, according to each concrete situation, without the post-revolutionary situation reversing the trend. In the context of Russia, still according to the arguments of the defensists, the Stalinist bureaucracy would fill the interstices highlighted by these gaps and would find there, at the same time, the basis for its differentiation from the proletariat as a bureaucracy and the link between its social function as a workers' bureaucracy and the historical function of the proletariat. It is at first sight unthinkable and repugnant to admit any connection between the Stalinist bureaucracy, whose collective and individual social and psychological rot has exceeded all bounds, and the historical function of the proletariat. Even Trotsky denied this connection since 1933, contrary to Trotsky's followers today. However, there it is necessary to put a brake on sensitivity, although it is one of the most solid components of materialist dialectics, in order to take objectivity to the limits of aberration. Anyone who is even slightly informed knows that in Russia the proletariat has no other participation in political power than that which it is subjected to by police terror. that it is rigorously excluded from the direction of planning, subjected to a form of exploitation more iniquitous than in the old capitalist countries, that it cannot resort to strikes without incurring repression, that its share in the distribution of the product of labor is minimal and always imposed, while the bureaucracy surrounds itself with oriental pomp. One could only accept, strictly speaking, the validity of defensist ideas if the bureaucracy, despite its greed and its innumerable crimes, oriented the economy toward equality of material and cultural possibilities. Without this, it is not a question of planning, but of any plan which leaves intact the foundations and the object of production, of a plan deliberately conceived not to satisfy the needs of men, in which case society can be in transition to anywhere except communism. The horse trading and sleight of hand of statistics, practiced since the first 5-year plan, has always hidden the most important economic realities for the proletariat, even the exploited one. We are mainly offered indices of industrial growth, although these are subject to caution. Nevertheless, with the help of political mystification, the quote, economic progress of the USSR, end quote, is currently fooling many activists, not just Trotskyists, but there are still other dupes, economists and stale scientists who find it to their advantage. It becomes, as Engels said about anti-Semitism, a reason for exaltation for fools. Instead of growth in general, that of certain industries or even space exploits, what it is essential to know. Is the level and mode of consumption of workers. On this point, statistics are almost silent, and for good reason! Exclamation point. This level of consumption is very low despite the improvement resulting from winning wars, and is also extremely hierarchical. There is no economic congress or conference that does not propose to, quote, improve wage systems, end quote. That is to say, to extract from each worker more production for each ruble paid. As for the mode of consumption it is given, it is imposed by wages. No worker can consume more than he earns, according to the rationing law of capitalism. Under such conditions, this economy cannot take the slightest step toward socialism. It is a managed economy, not socialist planning. In bourgeois society, expanded reproduction is carried out, starting from the interest of the owning class, which makes it an accumulation of capital, either of unpaid labor or in its form of goods, an accumulation of products taken from their producers. During the transition period, as well as in the full communist society, the expanded reproduction of the instruments of labor must be carried out, starting from the material and cultural necessities of society. Society must be understood from then on, not as opposed to the individual, the current case, but as the natural place of the individual's development. This is how accumulated capital will become non-capital, instruments of collective labor dominated by men. So this is like right there. That's kind of like an interesting statement, even though it's like it's definitely true. The is that the abolition of capital would entail, at least in a progressive direction, will entail the instruments of collective labor being dominated by men. But just right here, this is how accumulated capital would become non-capital, instruments of collective labor dominated by men. It seems like what he's saying here is he's specifically speaking to means of production, as if they were capital, right? It seems like there's not really much of an idea of capital being like a process, let alone a circulation process, right? It's like a thing. It's very much a thing here. Obviously, processes are things too, but it seems a little more frozen than what capital actually is, which is a not just a production process, as is often. It seems like it was often emphasized by a lot of people, but also a circulation process. Interesting if you're I don't know if anyone's even listens to these things, but if you're interested, I'm writing about these theories, and I did a search, and I could not find anywhere in Dostoevskaya, James, Cliff, uh, Muniz, anywhere the most basic thing in Marxist capital, which is the general formula of capital: money, commodity, money, prime. I could not find that equation in any of them. Um, which I think is telling, right? That um, their idea of capital is not, it excludes the moment of circulation. Now, the most convincing way that you can get around that, I think, is by saying that, okay, well, uh, the the circulation is on the global scale, right? So, um, you know, the Soviet Union buys means of production, right, from the world economy. Doesn't buy labor power from the world economy. Um, Puts that into a production process within the Soviet Union, produces a body of commodities that it then sells on the international market. Um, that's most convincing. I don't know how empirically true it is, but in terms on like the theoretical plane, um, that's what it would mean for the USSR to be one single capital, and that actually to make sense, right? Um, the circulation moment, right? So, and even in that would have to be altered, right? Because if you like go into deep, the further you move along into Marx's thing, it's not just money, commodity, money prime. The commodities broken down, right? Means of production and labor power. The USSR was not buying labor power from abroad, right? Um, on the world market. So I don't think that the general formula for capital is not seen in any of these texts, and lends uh, that lends credence to the idea that their concept of capital um, is severely lacking or impoverished. Um, it seems like means of production. It seems like almost like capital for them can be summed up in kind of like snappy, sort of like poetic words, like, I don't know, dead labor conquering living labor, which is like, uh, yeah, that's true. That is like an aspect of capital, but it does not capture the full picture of what capital is, right? Um, you could also say that, like, you know, any society in which the means of production are not the property of the direct producers, um, that the means of production, they're kind of instruments of domination, right? They're they're the purposes of those means of production are heteronymous to the interests of the direct producers themselves. But without that, without the value dimension, right, which is a circulation, it's just geared around circulation and not just around production. You don't can't I don't think you can say that those are that's a capitalist um, that is a capitalist system, right? Like, heteronomously controlled means of production processes is not enough to say it's capital. Of course, you can, and people do that. Like, for instance, Istvan Niceros talks about, like, um, basically his definition of capital is almost like capital is like production processes that are heteronomously controlled, which, that's good to critique. I think that's a good place to, if like your idea is to overcome capital and that's your definition of capital, then the overcoming of capital automatically entails emancipation in some capacity. So that's good. On the other hand, it seems rather insufficiently historical from a Marxian perspective that's steeped in the critique of political economy, as the state capitalists view their project as being the application of Marxian category, the idea that central features of capitalism, the central Marxian categories, are present in the USSR. So, yeah, so totally in favor of, ending the domination of production processes by heteronymous forces. But at the same time, I don't think that is what capital is. Capital, being a process that shares that, is also that, but it's not just that. Marx gave in his fundamental work the formula of capitalist reproduction: constant capital plus variable capital plus surplus value, where constant capital designates constant capital or instrument of production. Again, that's a bad definition of constant capital. Constant capital, instruments of production are part of constant capital, but constant capital is more than the instruments of production. It's the means of production generally considered. So maybe it's a bad translation that I'm using, but if he's instrument of production, usually means like tools of some kind, machines, whereas raw materials are also part of that, of the means of production, right? Variable capital, the variable capital, wages or means of subsistence for the workers. Again, that's true. Variable capital is wages, but they're not. Again, this is wages and the means of subsistence are not the same thing, right? For one, wages is a monetary form, and you can't eat the money, right? You have to purchase commodities. That's how means of subsistence are organized in capital. That's what the means of subsistence are in capitalism. They're commodities that the worker has to purchase. Also, wages are means of production. Obviously, you could say, like, might be splitting hairs here, but to say wages or means of subsistence, means that wages and means of subsistence are interchangeable, and they're fundamentally not, right? Wages are a particular social form. Means of subsistence are transhistorical, right? So there'll be means of subsistence in primitive communism, all those things. There's not. It's a very there's kind of like a consistent sort of collapse here, in my opinion. Sorry if you have to hear all my fucking opinions, but I'm recording these mainly for myself. Hopefully you get something out of them. But there's a conflation of use value and value categories, like, all over the place. Anyway, Marx gave in his fundamental work the formula of capitalist reproduction: constant capital plus variable capital plus surplus value, where constant capital designates the constant capital or instrument of production. The variable capital, wages or means of subsistence for workers, and surplus value, or value added in the labor process, part of which is consumed by the capitalist, another going to be capitalized for the increase of production. Which again, in the particular, under capitalism, right? The surplus value is used to purchase means of consumption by the capitalist. Part of it purchases means of production and labor power. That's what capitalization of surplus value is. It's reinvestment of money into new material, into commodities, means of production, and labor power. It's not just an immediate. It's not just an immediate. It's not an immediate consumption of surplus or an immediate accumulation of or immediate application of surpluses to growth. It's mediated through sales and purchases. Anyway, this increase thus necessarily passes through the expanded accumulation of capital. In bourgeois society, constant capital increases only to the extent that the capitalists realize the surplus value by selling the commodities in which it is incorporated. But this flow, we have seen it for decades, can be facilitated by the pure and simple destruction of a part of production in order to maintain the high level of prices. It is only in a certain proportion that constant capital and variable capital also increases. On the contrary, in a planned economy, understood non-capitalist, the increase of constant capital depends only on the needs of variable capital, which embraces the entire population. Again, right here, variable capital, the entire this is again, it's very unspecific, right? He's conflating constant capital means of production, and the needs of variable capital, as if they're just like the needs of the population, which are radically distinct. Anyway, on the contrary, in a planned economy, understood non-capitalist, the increase of constant capital depends on the needs of variable capital, which embraces the entire population, and on the size of surplus value. Again, right? Planned economy, surplus value, where's that being realized at? Such a reversal abolishes capitalist relations of production. Constant capital is no longer capital. Variable capital ceases to be the price of labor that reduces the majority of the population to a bare minimum, while surplus value appears in the form of newly created goods ready for individual and collective consumption. There are no longer any profits. That is, the labor of others appropriated by bourgeois officials or institutions. Any expanded reproduction must therefore be planned as a response to the direct demands of the human group constituting society. In other words, during the transition period, expanded consumption presides over expanded reproduction. Parenthesis, the old constant capital, end parenthesis. The ratio of economic factors contained in the formula constant capital plus variable capital plus surplus value is definitely changed. It's worth emphasizing the difference again in order to clearly see what is happening in Russia. Under capitalism, variable capital, wages or means of subsistence for workers, again, problematic, is always reduced to the minimum necessary in relation to the conditions prevailing on the labor market. Far from intervening as a determining factor in production projects, is only one of their results. As for surplus value, the newly created surplus value, which falls into the hands of the holder of previous surplus value or previous accumulated capital, is largely squandered by them and is, moreover, added to constant capital as additional investments, but only to make it yield more surplus value. The entire process of expanded reproduction depends, under capitalism, on surplus value, more concretely, on the appropriation of the entire product of social labor by the owners of the instruments of labor. And again, that is true, but you can appropriate the entire product of social labor. The owners of the instruments of labor can appropriate theoretically the entire at the very least the entire product of social labor without that product of surplus the products of surplus labor being having a surplus value form. Hence the contradictions inherent in capitalism on both the national and international scales. The first category of contradictions can be considerably attenuated by means of the control or concentration of capital by the state, or has been since the Second World War, but the contradictions between the various capitalisms or groups of capitalisms only become more apparent to the point of threatening the world with extermination. And moreover, the dirigism, which I think is statism or planism, I'm not sure. And moreover, the more dirigism, or if you will, planning based on the duality of capital and wage labor spreads, the more effective it seems, and the more heartbreaking becomes the contradiction between the system considered worldwide in social development, namely between the current form of production and distribution and the needs of everyone, between highly developed technology and the wage-earning class. In short, it is the contradiction between capitalist civilization and all its aspects in human progress, whose possibilities are grandiose and the reality is petty as it is oppressive. Dirigism, as opposed to planning in its revolutionary conception, calculates in dirigism's plans the non-satisfaction of needs, or what amounts to the same thing. Dirigism calculates on the basis of the expanded accumulation of capital. We always fall back on the growth of constant capital through the suction of surplus value by a social category. Whether one gives us justification, patriotic defense, modernization, the general interest, industrialization, or even socialism, it is always the same deception. The emergence of dirigism is one of the most important phenomena in contemporary history. It is closely linked to the negative outcome of the struggle of the world proletariat between the two wars. I will return to its political aspect at the end of this work. Now what is important is to grasp its material content. Dirigism is an expedient for capitalist society in its dire straits. Dirigism's previous development already permitted and required I guess it's capitalist society is actually what the it stands for. Its previous development already permitted and required the transition to the organization of communism, the framework created by capitalism being now too narrow and restrictive in all respects. Quote, as soon as this point is reached, all further evolution is decline, and all new development will take place on a new basis, end quote. Footnote. Karl Marx, Foundations of the Critique of Political Economy. End footnote. However, this new basis excludes economic relations as well as relations between humans and nature and between humans themselves. Emanating from the duality of capital and wage labor, dirigism fulfills precisely the role of preserving these relations inherited from the past. If it increases capitalist potential, it is at the expense of individual and collective development, by exhausting nature and humankind. However, No decline has begun, contrary to what so many vulgar Marxists think, with the destruction of economic potential. In this area, there is, above all, a growing gap between what the old system achieves and what a new system could achieve. The unrealized possibility leading to a decomposition of all the values created by the old civilization. From morals to political regimes, dirigism is no longer the blind, chaotic expression of capital, but one relatively conscious of its own laws. With these, he attenuates his internal contradictions and claims to veil the historical contradiction, making him incompatible with the social future. But what it does, it exacerbates the latter to the highest degree. Thus, the gigantism of accumulated capital overwhelms everyone more and more. It supposes a negation of what made the great rise of capitalist civilization. Finally, dirigism is reactionary because it supports exploitation and far from transforming necessity into freedom, chains man more to necessity, and it calls for totalitarianism. Assuming that it ends up creating a different type of social organization, this one would be worse and not better than the old capitalist system. If expanded reproduction is not carried out on the basis of a balance of social labor indispensable to progress, but on the basis of this same balance administered by a single category of men, it continues to be or becomes a surplus value of their property, and socialist planning proves impossible. A plan of exploitation can obviously be conceived starting from the interests of the exploiters. It is not then a question of making the conditions of work and life free, but of maintaining them under the control of the old system, instruments and products of labor becoming more and more foreign to the producers. Almost all countries today make plans of this kind, where private initiative is subordinated to that of the state, the agent of the capitalist community and the capitalist itself. The equivalence of these plans is also confirmed by the conditions they impose on the working class, not to mention the little-known fact that Russian and Chinese dirigistes are studying on the spot in the West the methods of elaboration and... One second. Sorry, that cuts off somewhere for some reason. This is because of the three terms of the formula: constant capital, variable capital, and surplus value. Constant capital is always passive, whatever the system. Expanded reproduction can only take its impetus either from the interest of a minority of men lurking behind surplus value, or from the short and long-term interest of the human mass included in variable capital. In the latter case only, it goes without saying, will the result be planning in the revolutionary sense of the term, breaking with exchange value, everything else being only retrograde programming. In short, dirigism, in the Russian or Western manner, is to planning what a compass in a vertical position is to another compass in a horizontal position. No revolutionary overcoming is possible if it does not eliminate the contradiction between consumer goods or use values and these same goods as exchange values or commodities. In other words, without cutting short the sale and purchase of everything that exists. Who is unaware that this venality, which extends to knowledge and consciences, has its source in the sale, purchase for capital, of labor power? Putting an end to wage labor is therefore a sine qua non condition. However, it must be remembered to ward off a barely perceptible but non-existent but not non-existent danger that slaves did not receive wages. For another form of exploitation to be established, control of the instruments of labor for another form of exploitation to be established, control of the instruments of labor, products, and society as a whole must pass to all workers to the exclusion of any particular social class or institution. The intervention of the proletarian revolution must begin with the solution to the problem of making surplus value disappear as surplus value manipulated at will by a minority. Then surplus value will be nothing but the newly created and desired product, intended to expand immediate consumption and subsequent production capacity. The fulcrum of the formula, constant capital plus variable capital plus surplus value, that is, the very dynamic of production, changes from surplus value to variable capital. There will no longer be anyone to monopolize surplus value, nor consequently constant capital. The workers dominating both of these terms that will themselves cease to be a class, and the revolutionary critique of political economy will have resulted in the negation of the latter by a system of social relations in which the human being, freed from the multiple constraints that stunt him, will be able to give his measure. The distinction between the production of instruments of labor, capital goods in today's jargon, and the production of consumer goods must, since the first day of communist organization, take on a completely different aspect. Under capitalism, expanded reproduction starts from the necessities of the instruments of labor section, while planning can calculate their expansion only by starting from the consumer goods section. The difference is radical and in itself implies the entire concept of planning for consumption. Apart from it, no need for industrialization can be felt that does not involve or reintroduce the essential function of capital, the extraction of surplus value. Even the creation of war industries against a real capitalist encirclement, not a fictitious one, as was the case in Russia since Stalinism, would once again trigger the mechanism beginning with the instruments of production sector, behind which a coterie of greedy masters would quickly, if not beforehand, hide. A revolution has no use for national defense. Its salvation lies in the victorious struggle of the proletariat of other countries, of those who might attack it first. The war between peoples and social groups played a decisive role in the emergence of classes in the state. The proletariat can only use civil war. Moreover, electronic and thermonuclear weapons are enough to consign any attempt at a military victory by a revolution to the realm of madness. In every country, these weapons must be paralyzed from within, and the armies disbanded. For the purpose of this demonstration, we must use the image of the transitional society given by Marx in the critique of the Gotha program. During the first cycles of planned reproduction, society will have to take from the total product 1. A quantity of consumer production for the population approximately equal to that intended for the same purposes before the revolution. 2. A quantity of production instruments to replace the wear and tear of those which exist, a quantity which is found incorporated into the products obtained. The surplus, newly created product, surplus value, or unpaid labor under capitalism. Marx divides into two parts, one to enlarge the instruments of labor, the other to improve the immediate consumption of workers. Marx thus indicates, on the one hand, that in the transitional society products lose the character of commodities, and on the other hand that in relation to the communist objective, distribution is the goal, collective property and planning the means. On this subject, a concession can be made to the defenders of Russia. They will only be easier to counter. Let us admit that the entirety of social surplus labor is used as instruments of production, without any improvement for the workers. The problem of distribution would then arise with greater magnitude and acuity. Even if we go so far as to suppose that at the beginning, all social surplus labor appears in the form of instruments of production, machines, it is impossible to consider several economic cycles without the repeated increase of the old constant capital, coming a broader and better consumption. It is not only a question of the immediate satisfaction of a working class that modern economism, still claiming to be Marxian, it is true, underestimates with a very scholarly or very flat nonchalance, but of the material conditions which must condition an uninterrupted rise in the culture and technical level, not of society considered in its traditional division, manual work, intellectual work, but of each of the individuals who compose it. Otherwise, nothing essential will have been changed. It has become essential to specify that this elevation, both material and cultural, which must result from planning, has absolutely nothing to do with the lures of, quote, defending the standard of living of the working class, end quote. What is at stake is putting an end to the sale of the labor force, which produces and reproduces, day after day, this class and its exploitation. We must attack to the cause, not to its effects. As long as consumption and knowledge depend on the price of the sale of labor power, we will not escape oppression. The transition period must therefore be characterized above all by consumption that breaks with the price of labor power. The law of value must be broken to leave only use value, measurable, not in price, not in money, but in concrete needs and unlimited range. For the Russian economists who are charged with the task of justifying the system, the law of value applies to the transitional period called socialist. Stalin himself made this, quote, discovery while filling the concentration camps with millions of men and murdering hundreds of thousands of others, whether or not they were supporters of the revolution. These economists do not bother to tell us when in this case it will disappear or begin to disappear, and for good reason. It is necessary, first of all, to overthrow the power and all the institutions it serves. The misery of their argumentation follows spontaneously from the nature of the system they are justifying. When they calculate the profits of enterprises, investments, etc. in money, it is not as they claim, quote, a way of accounting, end quote, without anything in common with that of other countries. Quite simply, they know the capitalist form of accounting, which is explicitly confirmed when they say that the profits go to the state, a state which, like any bourgeois, they identify with society, quote, the state of the entire people, end quote. In fact, through this state, they receive, with 15 or 20 million of their fellow bureaucrats, dividends, in cash and in kind, on the profits extracted from the difference between what was paid to the worker as the price of his labor power and the total product of this labor. The rule which governs all 5-year plans, quote, to extract the maximum possible profit from each ruble invested, end quote, governs the economy everywhere. This kind of accounting is inseparable from the system and vice versa. However, it is futile to try to refute the deliberate lie. One can only pillory it. Russian economists are mercenaries. In return, the claims of non-Stalinists who would have us believe that there is, underlying this, despite everything that may be said, something socialist, must be challenged. Pierre Nivelle provides the most learned argument for the various shades of Russia's defenders. It is therefore Nivelle's arguments that must be considered now. Nivelle's close exegesis of Marx's works in the, quote, New Leviathan does not interest us here except for the part concerning the fate of surplus value in a period of transition. Nivelle succeeds in this area much better than the venal laborers of the Kremlin. For according to Nivelle, 2. The law of value, somewhat modified, still weighs down the lower stage of communism, like a curse that men would strive in vain to ward off, the economic machine itself being the great redeeming sorcerer. He relies on Marx. That goes without saying. And he does not fall into the stupidity of representing Russian society as something resembling the outline given by Marx in the Critique of the Gotha program. He even explicitly says the opposite. Yet he speaks of state socialism, socialism being for him synonymous with the first phase of communism. But he only succeeds in combining such hostile terms by making Russia a society in transition, towards the society in transition to communism, and this for almost 50 years. The retreat is significant and implies a new revisionist view, with the double economic and political meaning of the old reformist revisionism. Neville explains himself, quote, "The organization of production and exchange depends on certain relations of production, that is, also on class relations, ultimately on a certain form of semi-collective appropriation of the product and the surplus product. It is from this appropriation that we must start. It is true that in the USSR it takes place in a different way than in private capitalism, but it still exists in a non-socialist form, because we are in a state socialism, limited in all respects, and this socialism does not reach by far the level of theoretical relations described by Marx. At most, it provides certain premises." End quote. Neville. The New Leviathan, Volume 3. We are therefore well short of a transitional society. Neville concedes to Stalinism that the premises in question, quote, "already presuppose serious transformations," end quote. But, we have just read, these are only the premises of the period of transition towards communism. In short, those which are created by capitalism itself and which have existed on a global scale for many years. Without them, the revolution of 1917 would never have taken place. On the other hand, the coherence of the definitions cited is far from satisfactory. It speaks of an appropriation of the product and, and the surplus product in Russia, which would be done, quote, "in a way other than in private capitalism," end quote, while recognizing that it is, quote, "non-socialist," end quote. Neville. Neither capitalist nor socialist, then, quote, "other," is a mystery, and it rather suggests, quote, "bureaucratic collectivism." However, Neville denies accepting this idea, as well as that of state capitalism. So Neville discovers that non-socialist appropriation is the result of a, quote, "state socialism," without the, quote, "other way" being clarified. What then does this, quote, "semi-collective" appropriation of the product and the surplus product, which means everything? In fact, appropriation can only be the surplus product accumulated or consumed by the administrators, surplus value, the necessary product corresponding to the sum of wages, even if the state must first hold this sum. Who then participates half or even a little in the appropriation of the surplus product? The workers? Neville would not go so far as to affirm this. However, there can be no other justification for this, quote, "semi-collective." Apart from the working class, they're only the servants of the state, including the economic apparatus. They're the ones who appropriate the surplus product in a semi-collective manner, one can admit, since it is to varying degrees, and it is only a minority of them who decide. But the mechanism they set in motion to do this is, and cannot be, but that of wage labor, including the production of goods, as for private capitalism. While waiting to address the nature of the Russian state and its position in the world, it must be emphasized that Neville is led to this contradictory conclusion by an article of faith that serves as an axiomatic truth, namely the nature of the Russian Revolution. Neville represents it as indisputably socialist, a flagrant lack of rigor in a work that claims to be scientific Marxist sociology. On top of this is grafted the theoretical conception of the immediately post-revolutionary period, and therefore the one in which, still according to the, quote, "critique of the Gotha program," law, and therefore the distribution of products, retains the stigmata of bourgeois law. However, what does this lower stage of communism do, if not erase all the stigmata, which are not, incidentally, raw bourgeois law? Far from it. It is therefore imperative to characterize this stage not by the much discussed traces of the past, when this is only a secondary component, but by the dynamics of its essential component, the organization of communism. On this point, Neville's, quote, socialist wage, end quote, confuses the issue as much as any, quote, profit sharing, end quote. Not to mention the misinterpretation of these two words, which feels like an insult, although wages may be, according to Neville's outline, a social interchange of work or unequal capacities of work, for work. They do not allow us to glimpse a bias that would erase class differences and the very division of labor. Industrial development and that of productivity, which are supposed to produce this erasure, will necessarily have to go hand in hand with an appropriation of consumer goods, from food to higher education, that breaks the dependence on any wage. It is then that we will set out towards the disappearance of classes, a transformation that materializes in the disappearance of the proletariat, and that the instruments of production, as well as what each individual needs to avoid being oppressed, will merge with distribution, and this with social labor and free time. The separation from labor power is at the origin of the exchange of equivalents. Labor power against the price of labor power. It can only cease in parallel with this kind of exchange. Neville draws his idea of a socialist wage from this undeniable fact. The total product of labor must always exceed that of collective consumption. Certainly, and this will be so even in the midst of communism. For this surplus labor, whatever this surplus labor's magnitude, to cease to be surplus value, the exploitation of man by man, this surplus labor's distribution, including immediate consumption and increased production, must ensure the abolition of wage labor. Workers and the sons of workers will inevitably find themselves in a position of inferiority, dominated by foreign economic and cultural forces, as long as they have only an equivalent of their capacity for work. A capitalist measure par excellence. It is entirely outside this measure, on the other hand, that the various physical and intellectual capacities will manifest themselves. Immediately eliminating the division between intellectual and manual labor, and consequently the stunting of all. Without satisfied desires, there is no fulfillment. Without satisfied desires, there is no fulfillment. Footnote. We will get out of this situation very simply without bringing in the famous value, end quote, writes Engels in Anti-Düring. End footnote. In the Critique of the Gotha program, Marx primarily intends to refute the charlatans who demanded the, quote, full product of labor, unquote. Marx envisages the transition period as it could have emerged from the level of productive power in his time. However, there is not a shadow of a doubt that for Marx the stigmata of bourgeois law would fade as production by the workers themselves recovered and increased, and that an unequal law without equivalent would emerge. He says this explicitly, quote, the elements of production are distributed in such a way that the present distribution of objects of consumption follows of itself, that the conditions of production are the collective property of the workers themselves. A distribution of objects of consumption different from that of today will similarly follow, end quote. Marx, Critique of the Gotha program. Furthermore, the possibilities offered by technical knowledge on the one hand and individual needs on the other are now incomparably greater than in Marx's time. The working day could be reduced by more than half in a short time, while multiplying the total product by 4 or 6, while the very functioning of society urgently demands the highest cultural level for all. In short, classes can be erased very quickly as far as their economic basis, that which is defined by law, is concerned. Only cultural distribution would take longer to take on a communist form. In the meantime, let no one come to us talking about socialist wages. This enormity cannot mask the reality of exploitation, in Russia any more than in any future situation. It is now possible to speak with certainty about the Russian economic system. None of its features can be equated with those of the society in transition to communism. The three elements of the formula, constant capital plus variable capital plus surplus value, fully, and even in the most brutal way, retain their capitalist characteristics. And for good reason. The 5-year plans followed to the letter, which is not to say that the greatest competence, the mechanism of expanded capital accumulation described by Marx, which eluded some of the obstacles of the old chaotic development of private capital. Again, right here. Sorry, I'm wrong. So much so that it can be affirmed that this capitalism was consciously organized on the pre-existing model in Europe and the United States. Marx and Engels said of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, founded by Godfrey de Bouillon in 1099, that its feudalism was more complete than any other, because it was deliberately built, planned, we would say today, taking that of France as its standard. Thus the men of the Kremlin put Marx's knowledge of capital accumulation to good use. Indeed, nowhere before had the increase in constant capital been carried out with such harshness by the part of the population that monopolizes surplus value and consequently all the gross product of the country. It dictates wages and prices without any competition. It compresses the former and inflates the latter at will. It multiplies the categories of workers. It legally reduces thousands, millions of men to slavery, forced labor camps, punishes factory workers more severely than did the bourgeoisie of the 18th and 19th centuries, fixes the entire proletariat in the workplace, imposes on each one a police, quote, workbook. Finally, it distributes among its own part of the surplus value. Distributes among its own a part of the surplus value and reinvests the rest as it sees fit. The immense majority of the population has only the salary, variable capital. Far from being the axis of the entire economic process, far from dominating surplus value and constant capital, it finds itself crushed between the one and the other, to such an extent that it is exposed to repression as soon as it shows the slightest economic or political resistance. I'm going to repeat that sentence. Far from being the axis of the entire economic process, far from dominating surplus value and constant capital, the immense majority of the population finds itself crushed between the one and the other, to such an extent that it is exposed to repression as soon as it shows the slightest economic or political resistance. Never has any bourgeoisie had such despotic hold over the conditions of exploitation as that of the lords of the Kremlin. But let there be no mistake. These are the very conditions of capitalist production brought to a paroxysm by very concrete historical avatars, which I will discuss later. The economic growth achieved at the cost of so much misery, repression, and the lowering of collective and individual consciousness is, all in all, quite poor, and it is especially evident in the military domain, which is always negative. Japan did much better, even before the de-divinization of the monarchy. Any slightly industrialized Western European country has an average productivity higher than Russia's, not to mention its agricultural productivity, which is still at the level of the most backward regions of the globe. The enthusiasm of so many left-wing technicians and intellectuals for Russia has, in truth, completely different reasons than the observation of economic results, much less that of political methods. The depravity of the latter often exceeds that of fascist methods, while simple economic growth could only be properly measured by having data relating to three essential points. 1. quantity of working hours of all kinds implemented during a given period. The demonstration would be all the more obvious if a longer period were chosen. 2. Part of these hours corresponding to newly created goods, i.e. amount of total surplus labor, surplus value. So meet parenthesis, surplus value in parenthesis. 3. Part of this amount incorporated into the work device for the further expansion of production with specification of sectors. The Kremlin dictators would not be what they are if they were able to provide us with data on these 3 points instead of stuffing the world with rigged production figures, or figures which, even if true, mean nothing about the achievement of socialism and very little about the efficiency of Russian capitalism in general. This is because, on the one hand, newly created goods have a very weak relationship with the quantity of labor hours used. The workers' consumption has made insignificant progress, and on the other hand, that investments are minimal compared to the rate of surplus value extorted. All Western capitalism, and that of Japan, is ahead of Russia in these 2 areas. To excuse or explain the intensive and extensive exploitation imposed in Russia, some have spoken of a, quote, primitive accumulation of socialism, end quote. Others simply of primitive capitalist accumulation. But socialism has no use for any accumulation of capital. As soon as it is there, it seizes the previous accumulation, and this act abolishes it. To the extent that it finds itself in the necessity of building its own industrial resources, these will proceed directly from the labor commanded by the consumption of the workers, not from the sale for a wage. In short, not from an alienated force. To believe at the present time that the workers of a country, even a backward country, can do nothing without having surplus value extorted from them that others would undertake to accumulate testifies, at the very least, to a spell by the economic thought of the system of exploitation. As for primitive capitalist accumulation, it was largely accomplished in Tsarist Russia. That's a crazy thing to say. The Stalinist regime neither renews nor reinforces it. It is true that this regime harasses the proletariat and the poor with a savagery that bears no relation, except to that of the primitive period of capital in the West as described by Marx. All the same, there is no meaningful parallel to be drawn. In Western Europe, this was the beginning of an era of social development. In Russia, nothing similar is beginning, but something is withering away. And what is withering away is the same capitalist world whose expansion was triggered by primitive accumulation. Any philosophy of history that does not record these facts will prove reactionary. The last 50 years have made this evident in Russia and almost everywhere else in the world. Okay, so that's the end of part 1 of Grandizo Munis's Party State Stalinism Revolution. The section is titled The Russian Economic System and the Transition to Communism. I might upload these as each distinct sections. I'll probably actually do that. That makes sense. Reading the first part took me way longer than I thought it would. There's 5 more parts, so thanks for listening.